Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and it's our pleasure to be the host for the Framing the Future webinar series. This morning's program is a very special program, one we've been looking forward to for quite some time. It's going to be on the legislatively mandated study on forest loss here in Maryland, and provide some insights into how we might address some of the opportunities that lie ahead of us, particularly in things like the 5 Million Trees program. Let me remind all of you that the program will be recorded. It'll be made available later via YouTube and on the foundation website. Again, I want to welcome all of you here, and I'm going to turn to our moderator for this session, and that is Megan Carr. Megan, looks like they're getting ready to go really quickly. Go ahead.
Absolutely. We're very pleased to have our guests here today. This is a topic that we've been wanting to cover for some time and are very excited to learn about the results of this study and to hear from three of the researchers. Before we get going, just want to make a couple of brief reminders for our audience. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter those into the Q&A box. The chat is more for, we may be able to share a link to the study results via the chat later, but for questions that you would like to see addressed to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. And we will get right to it. So ordinarily, I provide a brief introduction to the topic area, but for this month, we have much greater expertise to bring to bear in that department. So we're starting today with Dr. Kate Everts, who is a professor of plant pathology at the University of Maryland, where she conducted research and outreach for 24 years. In 2020, she became the director of the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology. There, she leads work to develop collaborative solutions to challenges faced by Maryland's farms and forests that retain working landscapes while protecting the waters of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. The Hughes Center's current work addresses resilient food systems, forest change in the face of development, saltwater intrusion, soil health, sustainable agriculture in urbanized landscapes, and the impact of climate change on Maryland's farms. So welcome, Dr. Everts.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for inviting us to present. This is very timely. As you may know, yesterday, November 16th, we released the technical study on changes of forest cover and tree canopy in Maryland. The Harry R. Hughes Center, along with the Chesapeake Conservancy and the University of Vermont. And we're very pleased to be able to share the findings today with your group. As you know, forests represent one of the most important natural resources in Maryland. They're critical to our economy, the environmental sustainability of our state, as well as human health. And its forest conservation has been recognized by the state as a central strategy to achieve the goals that were laid out in the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So the legislature decided that it was appropriate time to monitor forest and tree canopy cover within the state. And so in 2019, the General Assembly passed Senate Bill 729, and then the language was repeated again in House Bill 991 in 2021, and it required the production of a technical study of changes in Maryland's forest cover and tree canopy. So to satisfy the provisions of that bill, the Harry R. Hughes Center conducted several listening sessions across Maryland, starting in 2019. And in 2020, we released a request for proposals through an open RFP process to solicit people who are interested in assisting on this technical study. Following that RFP process, the Chesapeake Conservancy and the University of Vermont submitted a proposal. Their proposal was reviewed by several subject matter experts, and following that rigorous review, the Hughes Center awarded the Conservancy and University of Vermont funding to develop major parts of this report, this technical report that you're going to hear today. In addition to that, there were some sections of the legislation that were completed by Dr. Addie Dubé, who of the Hughes Center. You'll also hear from her a little bit later in this program. And her work followed on some preliminary work that was conducted by two interns that we had through our Russ Brinsfield intern program, and they were Harry Huntley and Maeve Kessler. So before we get started, I do want to take the opportunity to thank two different groups. First, we had an advisory committee throughout this process. Our advisory committee consisted of representatives of the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of the Environment, Maryland Department of Planning, Maryland Department of Agriculture, the Chesapeake Bay Program, and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Their expertise was really critical in helping us both develop ways to look at the questions asked in this study, as well as their input was really valuable and made this report much better than it would have been without their input. So we are really thankful for the time and effort and expertise they shared with us throughout the process. We do want to note, though, that the views that are expressed in this webinar are really those of the speakers and not necessarily the advisory committee. The second group that I want to thank is Maryland's legislatures. They really had foresight in recognizing that this was a critical time to conduct this study, and look at previous legislation like the Forest Conservation Act, especially as we move forward now with new goals and new legislation. For example, the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021. So this was a timely and valuable request from the legislature, and we really thank them for their foresight. So with that, I just want to say the study, again, I feel like it was just, we are at a critical time, and this study will help us look at where we are at and the results of our policies previously here in Maryland, and how to move forward to improve both the health of our forests and their connectivity and the extent of our forests. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker. Susan Minnemeyer joins us from the Chesapeake Conservancy in Annapolis, Maryland. She serves as Vice President for Climate Strategy, and she's leading efforts to accelerate the development of nature-based solutions for the Chesapeake Bay watershed that build on our region's deep expertise in ecosystem restoration. Prior to that role, Susan led the Chesapeake Conservancy's Conservation Innovation Center for 2 years and led their effort to leverage high-resolution data and novel approaches to geospatial analysis to support conservation restoration. Susan has over 20 years of experience related to forest monitoring, including serving as a senior GIS manager for the forest program at the World Resources Institute. So Susan, if you want to continue.
Great, thank you, Kate. So in conducting this study, we took a comprehensive look at Maryland's forests over decades of data, and we used 3 independently developed and managed data sets to examine trends in forest extent, the drivers of forest change, including forestry development and Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts, and engaged with the advisory committee Kate referred to, made up of Maryland's leading experts on forests and related topics. Our goals in conducting the study were to collect and analyze a broad array of information, to organize and distill the results to identify key insights, and to make this information transparent and accessible to a wide array of experts and stakeholders who are interested in using this information to enable data-driven decision-making across the state. So our work on the study was organized into 7 key tasks that were outlined by the legislature. And these were first looking at forest and tree canopy extent, understanding how much forest is in Maryland, how it's distributed across the state, and also what opportunities there are for forest restoration and tree planting. On forest health, we focused on 2 key topics of forest fragmentation and invasive species. On Chesapeake restoration, task 3, we looked at progress through Chesapeake Bay program restoration efforts related to the conservation practices that involve tree planting or increasing forest cover on urban tree planting and riparian forest buffers. On forest and tree canopy change, we looked at what changes have been observed in Maryland's forest and tree canopy and what is projected for further changes by the Bay program. And then on progress, we looked at what progress has been made to date in tree planting programs and protection of forests across the state. And then the Hughes Center focused on these last 2 tasks, which looked at mitigation banking under the Forest Conservation Act and forest and tree planting programs across the state, what funding is available, and what tree planting efforts have been implemented to date. The 3 data sets that we used in the study are outlined here. So we used, first of all, the Forest Service FIA data, which is a federal project, of course. It's based on field sampling and field inventory. It has a history of nearly 90 years and is probably the most advanced forest inventory program in the world. It has a very reliable basis of data over a long time period. But one shortcoming for the purposes of what Maryland is interested in a state study is that the sampling density is sufficient for statewide estimates, but it can't be used for like county-based local or regional studies within the state. So it had some limitations there, and it also doesn't provide, like a map of where within the state change is happening. So to cover those interests, we looked at the National Land Cover Data Set, which is run by a federal consortium of agencies called the MRLC. And the data is based on the 30-meter Landsat data, which the Landsat satellites have been in orbit for over 40 years, I believe, at this point. And it's a national data set. It's updated on a periodic basis, approximately every 3 to 5 years. And it provides longer-term changes that are spatially explicit across our watershed. And then in the most recent time period, covering a period from 2013, 2014 to 2017, 2018, we have the new Chesapeake Bay program land cover land use data. It was first released as a land cover land use product in 2017. And then earlier this year, the first change data were made available. And this is produced by a partnership of Chesapeake Conservancy with the University of Vermont, partnering with the USGS, especially on producing the land use data related to this. And this data is used in the Chesapeake Bay program CAST model and will be going forward. So some important definitions that we used in this study is we talk about land cover and land use. Land cover has been described as, the view from above. It's what you would see out of an airplane window flying above the land. You can see where forest and tree canopy is, low vegetation, water bodies, and you can observe changes in that land cover. But land use is the data where you are able to really indicate how people are using the land. And to develop the land use data in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we used a lot of ancillary data sets from county and state governments, including zoning, road data sets, a lot of ancillary information that would provide greater detail on how the land is being used. And it is this land use data where we made the distinction between what is considered forest and what's considered tree canopy outside forest. So all 3 of these data sets that I mentioned have independent definitions of forest cover. The FIA data, just some commonalities between them. Both the FAA data and the CBPO data have a minimum threshold of 1 acre in forest size. And then for the CBPO data, we also had a definition of patches at least 240 feet in width. So generally for those, for example, riparian forest buffers do not count as forest, but they are considered tree canopy outside forest. I'll zoom in on the map to see a little bit more detail. This is in College Park, where you can see that most of the urban tree cover, the tree canopy on campus, is in tree canopy outside forest, but in larger parks and protected areas, there's forest cover in the area as well. And I just want to mention to you, within the NLCD data, theirs is a satellite-based definition. They looked for 30 meter by 30 meter pixels that were composed of at least 20% forest canopy. So that it's a bit of a distinctive difference between a field-based definition and one based on the satellite data. This image shows the NAPE imagery that was used for the high resolution data. This is collected by the USDA's National Agriculture Imagery Program. It's imagery collected by airplane rather than satellite, and it's updated on an approximately 3-year rotation nationally, and collected during the growing season. We also considered several important Maryland legislation around forest and forest conservation in this study, particularly the Forest Conservation Act of 1991, which requires a forest management plan for large developments and for forests to be set aside during the development process and for forest loss to be mitigated. The Forest Preservation Act of 2013 added some additional goals, namely a 40% forest cover goal for the state and a no net loss of forest cover. And then the Chesapeake Bay Agreement of 2014, which put in place goals for improving water quality that required many tree-based interventions, like urban tree planting and forested riparian buffers I mentioned earlier. So for the longest term trends, we relied on the FIA data, and you can really see patterns and change of forest over time across the state. There was a rapid increase in forest loss that happened with suburbanization in the 1960s through the 1980s. By the time of the Forest Conservation Act being implemented, you start to see a decline in the rate of forest loss. And then in the most recent time period, really since 2010, you see a stabilization of the change in the amount of forest loss across the state, to achieving such a low rate that the FIA reports have said that Maryland's forest cover is stable, that the rate of loss is within the error bars of the data set. So in terms of a long-term trend, there is a strong trend towards stabilization of forest cover on average across the state. Looking at regions, not surprisingly, Western Maryland has the greatest amount of forest cover in the state, and most of the tree canopy cover is within forest, the dark green bars. In Central Maryland, there's a much lower overall amount of forest remaining, and a much higher proportion of that forest cover is in tree canopy outside forests. The tree canopy outside forests, as I mentioned, includes both urban tree canopy and agricultural trees. On the Eastern Shore, where you have a much greater portion of the land in agriculture, as well as in coastal and tidal wetlands, there's much lower forest overall, and a lower percentage of forest within urban areas. So this is a really important table for understanding the outcomes of the report. So first of all, I want to just point out, so on the left-hand side, we have the different data products And what we see here is that the total estimates of forest vary by a fair range between the three products. And some of this is related to either the targeting of the monitoring. In the case of the FIA, it is aimed at specifically monitoring forest, and this data stream is not particularly targeted at tree canopy outside forest. The NLCD data set detects more tree canopy, and some of that is because of the capability of the 30-meter satellite data to see more tree canopy. And then the Chesapeake Bay Program Office 1-meter data sees significantly more tree canopy. But a lot of this is that tree canopy outside forest. And for this reason, and because the Bay Program is interested in both forest cover and total tree canopy, this product developed a forest definition that was tied to the FIA data. So there's, there only a small difference between the total forest estimate and then tree canopy that did not fit that definition is mapped separately as tree canopy outside forest. And this makes the results more comparable to our traditional forest data sets. Okay, so then looking over the time periods analyzed in the data, with the FIA data, there was an overall 4.6% decline in tree canopy, but this really tailed off, and the rate of forest loss was greatly reduced after 2010. There was a negative 0.23% annual change estimated. The NLCD data found a negative 0.39% change over an 18-year time period, for an annual change of negative 0.022%. And then with the Chesapeake Bay Program Office, it is only this 5-year time period, approximately 2013 to 2018, with a 0.39% total decline or an estimated annual change of negative 0.07%. And then in evaluating this data, we really encourage people to look at one data set across time, look horizontally across the table, rather than to try to compare, FIA data at one time period with the total amount of forest with a different product at a different time period. Because there's really, because of the way the data is collected, they see a different portion of the tree canopy cover, but there is a lot of consistency in each independent data set across time. And just mentioning with the previous slide is, one important factor too is that they are all in agreement on forest cover still declining, but that the rate of forest cover decline has been greatly reduced over time. So that gives us a lot of confidence in the overall consensus on results. So for forest health, we looked at two factors: forest fragmentation and invasive species. With the fragmentation data set, we used a tool called CLEAR. It was developed by the University of Connecticut. We ran the fragmentation on the high resolution data for 2013 and 2018. And we did have some difficulty because in looking at fragmentation with the high resolution data, it does actually see the gap between trees in an otherwise intact forest area. So you do see this pattern of these sort of like small isolated patches of clearing within a forest cover. And we did actually resample to 10-meter resolution for this analysis, because CLEAR was really developed for use with moderate resolution imagery like Landsat. Looking at the two fragmentation analyses over time, we saw, an increase in smaller core forest size and these isolated forest patches. And we also saw a strong trend towards some of these isolated patches being further fragmented until the area is small enough that they no longer qualified as forest, but went into the tree canopy outside forest category. And then in terms of the regional differences in Central Maryland, we saw much more fragmentation than other portions of the state. On invasive species, has been really a challenge to find comprehensive data collected in a uniform way across the landscape. A lot of the evidence is very anecdotal, but we found the best data in the FIA data set where they looked at disturbance within forest plots. The FAI data showed that across Maryland, 12% of forest land had what were considered large-scale disturbances. And of these disturbances, the majority of those were caused by invasive species. And in terms of large-scale disturbances, the greatest impacts were from invasive vines like Oriental bittersweet or Chinese wisteria that were overtopping tree canopies and causing tree mortality or suppression of the tree canopy. So this is a topic where there was not an abundance of information, but what we could find really shows the importance of this issue, and also that invasive species can be very tied to fragmentation because that's the vector by which invasive species can enter forest areas where they haven't been seen before. On Chesapeake restoration progress, we looked at two types of goals. First, the overall goal for the watershed agreement for 70% tree canopy coverage in riparian forest buffer areas by 2025. On this goal, we found that the Maryland average is 58%, and we noted a lot of progress, but not reaching the goal. But however, some of this lack of progress is due to differences in geography and land cover in different portions of the state. So we had much higher rates in Western Maryland. Allegheny County was had the top amount of coverage at 79%. Somerset County was at 26%, but just noting that within the Eastern Shore counties, they had a significant amount of riparian areas in wetlands and tidal wetlands, especially where tree canopy coverage would not be possible. So I think this is a case where the goal may not be appropriate to be applied at a county by county scale. Really for the county goals, that is looking at Maryland's Watershed Implementation Plan, the WIP, where goals were set county by county that are more appropriate to what is possible and feasible in each county. And we have full statistics in the report. And just commenting on pulling out some of the urban tree canopy goals in this slide is that generally we saw the large urban areas like Montgomery and Prince George's County having substantial net loss of urban tree canopy, but in some of the smaller urban areas across the state and also in Baltimore City, we saw tree canopy gains. So smaller urban areas like Salisbury, Westminster, Chestertown, and Easton also saw gains. This is the first time we've been able to look statewide at tree canopy outside studies. Prior to the Chesapeake Bay program data, we would rely on individual municipalities' urban tree inventories. So I think greater understanding of these trends will happen over time. The next iteration of the high resolution data will come out in 2024 and cover the time period through 2021. So we also looked at transitions in both the NLCD data and the high resolution data. And between these, just to explain how these charts work, the initial time step is on the left, and the categories listed are the total amount of areas that changed. And we found for both NLCD and the high resolution data that forest had the greatest amount of areas that changed across the state. This was 38% with the NLCD. And again, that is a 2001 to 2019 time period. But also in the shorter time period with the high resolution data, forest and other tree canopy had 49% of all areas that changed across the state. Then we looked at what the resulting class for areas that changed, and this is the right-hand column. So with the NLCD change, developed classes were the largest resulting class, 36%. But interesting to note that of development, about half is coming from forest and half is coming from agriculture. And then with the high resolution data, we saw a similar pattern. This saw a greater amount coming from forest and other tree canopy. And I believe that difference is also caused by the fact that in the high resolution data, we're mapping tree canopy outside forest as a separate class. Whereas in the NLCD data, they just have like low, moderate, and high intensity development classes. Okay, so we looked next at forest and tree canopy change across the state and at total net change. Previously I was talking about urban tree canopy, but I want to note that tree canopy outside forest, these light green bars, also includes tree canopy in agricultural areas. So when we're looking at all tree canopy outside forest, we actually saw a net increase in that category across the state. Some sources of the increase, there are some that are more positive, like we did see a net increase in tree canopy outside forest in agricultural areas, reflecting Chesapeake Bay restoration. Some of this increase, though, is fragmentation, where forest came out of a forest class and resulted in a tree canopy outside forest. Central Maryland was the only region across the state that had net declines in both forest and net tree canopy outside forest. So we made a further subset of the change, only focusing on change to development, so forest loss to development, where this is considered a permanent land use change. And this included both change to impervious surface, so the actual roads and the buildings, and as well as pervious low vegetation representing development, which was primarily lawn and turf. So again, we saw some similar patterns to what I showed previously, but even an even stronger trend towards Central Maryland being the primary region where forest loss to development is taking place, and much smaller rates in different regions of the state. And we did see some change in developed areas to tree canopy, and this is the growth of trees in urban and suburban areas that are growing over turf. So especially where agriculture is converting to development, we saw that these residential properties on former ag land often generated net increases in tree canopy compared to agricultural land. We looked at these development changes for individual counties, and there's some statistics in the executive summary of the report and our press release. In total, Prince George's County and Montgomery County represented 44% of total forest and tree canopy change to development across the state. So it's very concentrated in Central Maryland. And we found that the top 6 counties, PG, Montgomery, Anne Arundel, Charles, Baltimore, and Calvert, totaled 70% of tree canopy loss associated with development. And then we saw much lower rates in other parts of the state. And we do see the gain in tree canopy in Baltimore City, and Carroll County had the greatest gain in tree canopy associated with development. And again, that might be related to transition of agricultural lands into developed areas. But overall, just a very strong pattern here on where forest loss to development is taking place. Okay, so next we looked at forest and tree canopy commitments. This again is relating to Bay program goals, but also other tree planting goals. So this included a survey of tree planting across the state that was led by the Hughes Center. And we also included an estimate of how much new area of forest and tree canopy could be produced by the Tree Solutions Now Act at a rate of 400 trees per acre. We estimate up to 12,000 acres of forest and tree canopy could be established. And then nearly 2,000 acres of planted trees were documented in the study. And there have been other targets produced at various points across the state, potential for 68,000 additional acres of forest, and that's based on an analysis of low vegetation data rather than being a specific statewide goal. But we identified another 9,000 acres of urban tree canopy goals across the state from various programs. On protected areas, there's some really positive news. Maryland is one of the leaders in the Chesapeake Bay program in terms of accelerating the rate of land protection statewide. In 2018, the state was at 26.9% of total protected land, and that represented 33.2% of Maryland's forests being in protected lands and 9.3% of the state's tree canopy outside forest. Since 2018, Maryland has reached 29% land protected in 2021, and I understand it is on the cusp of reaching success on the 30 by 30 protected land goal that has been adopted by the Bay program. So my understanding is that Maryland leads the watershed in terms of total land protection. And we also looked at tree canopy change, total tree canopy change in protected areas across the state. And we found an additional 2,000 acres were established in protected areas. And this is a really important thing to note, because I think the common thinking is that protected areas prevent forest loss. But this would be the first comprehensive look with high-res data on how much additional tree canopy is being generated in protected areas across the state. So, this includes everything from tree planting on playgrounds, recreational areas, as well as targeted forest expansion within protected areas. And this number includes publicly owned lands as well as private lands under conservation or agricultural easements. We also assessed afforestation and reforestation opportunities across the state. And for this analysis, we created a new data set, which was a derivative of our high resolution land use data, where we identified turf, low vegetation, and barren lands. For the purposes of the study, we were looking to identify more permanent tree cover opportunities. So agricultural areas were not included, but we did treat those separately under the Chesapeake Bay program goals for riparian forest buffers, for example. With this analysis of plantable areas, we also did exclude a fairly extensive array of areas ranging from naturally open ecosystems, across the state with data from Maryland DNR, as well as areas, where zoning would not permit tree cover to be established. And we also excluded projected sea level rise areas from these estimates using the CRAB sea level rise projections. So across the state, we identified 374,000 potential acres. The most are in Central Maryland, Baltimore, Montgomery, and Prince George's County. The least in Kent and Somerset. Again, we have Somerset, I think the extensive coastal wetlands area, really limited potential change, as well as, high portions of agricultural lands, because those were not included. And we anticipate this data set could be very useful for local governments for planning purposes. For example, if you wanted to come up with a goal for how much forest and tree canopy could be established on publicly owned lands, playgrounds, school properties, or other such designated areas. Using this data set along with zoning data could be very helpful for identifying those opportunities and setting goals that are reasonable given the land that's available. So with that, I'm going to transition now. Dr. Adi Dubé is going to present on the task 6 and 7, mitigation under the Forest Conservation Act and tree planting programs. And she recently completed her PhD at the University of Maryland and is working in the field of agricultural and sustainable ecosystems. So Adi, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Susan. So I'm going to jump right into task 6, which focus on forest mitigation banking in the state. So for a little background info, though I'm sure you're all familiar with this, the FCA has reforestation or afforestation requirements for development projects in the state in order to mitigate forest loss. There is a priority order for that, starting with on-site mitigation, followed by different off-site mitigation options, and finally a fee in lieu payment to the county if neither on-site or off-site mitigation is feasible. Purchasing credits from a privately owned forest mitigation bank is one of those off-site options. And traditionally, there have been two types of bank: planted and retention. However, retention banks, where a landowner simply conserves existing trees on their property rather than planting new trees, are being phased out and new ones are no longer permitted. So the first specific question that we were asked to address in this report was about the regulation of siting and location of forest mitigation banks. So this is done on a county level. However, the FCA does outline criteria for the priority locations for banks in order to maximize ecosystem services that those trees provide. Examples include riparian buffers, steep slopes, and 100-year floodplains. And counties may have additional requirements as well. The next question was about the capacity and location of active banks. So here we're basically looking at which counties in the state have banks and which ones don't. So starting in green, as Susan mentioned, these are the most heavily forested parts of the state, and Garrett and Allegheny County are actually exempt from the FCA because of their high forest cover. Then in purple, we have a few counties as well as Baltimore City, which do not have any provisions for banks. So that is not an option in those places. Next, in yellow, we have 3 counties that do have the provision for banks. However, banks have never actually been established there. So they're meeting their mitigation needs elsewhere. And finally, all the remaining counties do have banks, although for the ones in white, we weren't able to get complete data about their acreage and type of banks. So in total, we're looking at about 17,258 acres of banks in the state, of which at the time of survey, 4,748 were active or available for the purchase of credits, although we would expect that number to change pretty frequently as credits are sold and new banks are established. The next question was looking at the proportion of planted banks versus retention banks. So here we're just focusing on the counties that we know have banks and the ones for which we have good data. And so there's only one county that has never allowed retention banks, and that is Carroll County, that only has planted banks. The ones in purple only have retention banks, though that's obviously going to change moving forward. And then the ones in blue have some combination of both types. However, even in the counties that have both, retention banks still tend to be more common. And on the whole, retention banks make up about 81% of all mitigation banks in the state, with planted banks only making up roughly 19%, so much smaller proportion. The next question was comparing the market for banking to fee and lieu rates and seeing if there's a relationship between those two things at the county level. So we did not observe any previous relationship between these two things. It's worth keeping in mind that banks are only one of several different mitigation options open to developers, and there's no reason to expect that banks in particular would have a strong relationship with fee and lieu compared to anything else. Additionally, of the 12 counties that have both mitigation banks and fee and lieu payments as options, the majority of them just use the rates that are outlined in the Forest Conservation Act. So they're not setting rates independently based on market the market or anything else. However, there is the possibility that in the future, in order to encourage the creation of new planted banks, increasing fee in lieu rates could be one way to do that. The next question was about the effect of retention banks on the no net loss of force policy that the state has. So we did pose this question to county employees, but they didn't feel that they really had the necessary data and information to comment on this. And this would have been sort of beyond the scope of what we could calculate as well, because every county has different rules and regulations, collects different data, and then you add additional complexities like the fact that you can purchase credits to make up for afforestation or reforestation credits, and it all gets quite complicated. However, it is worth keeping in mind that on the whole, banks comprise less than 1% of the total forest cover in Maryland. So while this is an important question, whatever impact they have is ultimately going to be on a pretty small scale. The final question for task 6 was the potential for banks to improve water quality in the watersheds in the state. So broadly speaking, afforestation is associated with water quality improvements, especially in riparian areas, and riparian buffers are a priority area for creating forest banks. However, we would only expect to see this benefit from planted banks and not retention banks where no afforestation is actually taking place. So moving on to task 7, this was about tree planting programs, specifically a programmatic and funding review of federal, state, and local tree and forest planting programs in Maryland. So here we looked at data from specifically 2018 and 2019. And as Susan mentioned, we estimated a total of about 1,854 acres of trees planted in the state during this time at a rate of about 400 trees per acre. Over half of these were planted through Forest Conservation Act mitigation efforts, and the others through various government and non-governmental planting programs on all levels, from federal programs like CREP to state level programs like Tree Mendus Maryland, county level programs like Reforest Montgomery, and municipal programs as well. It is worth keeping in mind that this number is very likely an underestimation. Only 20% of the municipalities in the state responded to our request for information, and private efforts were not reviewed systematically. There's too much variation between these different tree planting programs to directly compare them or draw a lot of broad conclusions about them, because they really cover a large scale in terms of their scope, the amount of money being spent, the numbers of trees being planted, and so on. For example, one of the largest programs we observed was one in Baltimore County, where $1.7 million were spent on planting about 14,000 trees, compared to one in College Park, which was a homeowner reimbursement program that spent about $1,800 on 19 trees. So there's just a huge scale here. Finally, I have a few recommendations for task 6 and 7. In terms of forest mitigation banks, it's pretty clear, given the prevalence of retention banks so far, that the state and counties will need new strategies to encourage the creation of planted banks. One example could be helping landowners with the initial investment that they make, because planted banks cost a lot more money to set up than retention banks. And although landowners can ultimately set their own prices for the credits they're selling, it can take several years before they're able to start selling credits and recoup their investment. We would also recommend more uniform collection and better availability of data about banking so that these things can continue to be tracked more easily in the future, and also making information about how to buy credits and set up banks more accessible for the public in order to spur on interest in banking programs and make people more aware about them. An example here is the website for Montgomery County, which does a really great job of putting all the information out there and making it easy to access. And on the right is a map from their website showing where banks are located in the county. Finally, when it comes to tree planting programs, we also recommend more centralized tracking of this data, and that's going to be done by MDE moving forward in accordance with the Tree Solutions Now Act, which we approve of. That'll be great. And with that, I will pass it back to Susan for some final remarks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hattie. Let's see. Okay, so to summarize the overall conclusions of the report at the high level, we found that this rate of forest loss in Maryland has moved from rates of significant decline towards stabilization. since the Forest Conservation Act of 1991. I mean, also want to note that there's a number of other efforts like the Maryland Forest Preservation Act of 2013 and the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement driving that stabilization. But despite this trend, forest loss for development and forest fragmentation do continue to be significant trends, especially in central Maryland, although there's regional variation across the state. The state has, we feel, a significant opportunity, given the stabilization of forest loss, to transition from loss to gain. And this can be done based on findings in the data through two main tracks. One focused on increasing the amount of forest and tree area through planting, and the other on protecting forests or avoiding additional forest loss. On the tree planting side, with the Tree Solutions Now Act of 2021 and this large array of other sources for tree planting funding, there is a lot of new investment. Just want to note, though, that we did note in the study that for the results of this tree planting to be seen in the remote sensing data, we estimate it's about 5 to 15 years before significant gains in tree canopy from planting are observed. And this is related to, you know, the small size of the new trees, as well as the time needed for significant growth to achieve minimum detection capability. And then on the forest protection side, as I mentioned earlier, we did see a net gain of tree canopy in protected areas. And we also highlight in our data that there can be opportunities through tree planting also to increase forests within protected areas. For example, plantings along the boundaries of core forest areas. So in summary, we saw a lot of evidence in the data for these two strategies, both contributing towards the forest stabilization in Maryland, as well as opportunities to increase overall forest and tree canopy. And then on recommendations, we did limit our recommendations to more technical matters related specifically to data and monitoring, in terms of not getting too much into policy matters. But we did really see some benefits from, first of all, monitoring forests from these three different independent data streams, because I think that gives a lot of a greater certainty in the results, especially where they agree on long-term trends. And we did think that monitoring trends over time was a better strategy than trying to hit specific targets. On the high resolution data side, this is a new product that was funded through the Chesapeake Bay program, and we would encourage continuing the funding and investment in that data stream, as well as the state continuing to use the FIA and NLCD data long term. There is I do want to mention there is a new forest carbon monitoring system that has been developed over the last couple of years in Maryland, and I believe that that should be coming online very soon in the near future. So that would add a fourth product that is specifically geared towards the opportunity for forest climate mitigation through the state's climate work. So another challenge that Addie highlighted a lot was the challenge of collecting data systematically from county and local programs. This is addressed some in the plan for the Tree Solutions Now Act, but we really recommend first standardized data collection, and then making that data transparent and available, because as we mentioned, there can be a long time period before tree planting efforts are seen in the data. So for monitoring progress, we really need better data at a centralized level in terms of the state's overall progress on planting. Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to this project, including staff at the Hughes Center, the Chesapeake Conservancy, and the UVM Spatial Analysis Laboratory, as well as our advisory committee, who gave us a lot of detailed feedback on drafts of the report and really improved and strengthened the overall conclusions of the study. So thanks. And with that, I think we would be available to answer questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate the very thorough discussion. There is a lot of data to go over. And of course, we do have some questions. I did want to note, if folks would like to take a look at the report, we do have the link up in the chat. So do feel free to follow that. Some of those detailed questions, things related to methodologies and things of that nature may be answered within that. But while we have a few minutes left, we have a couple of questions, starting with a sort of a basic methodology question from Michael. What is the minimum area and or density needed to be considered forest as opposed to canopy outside of forest areas?
Right. So I mentioned that with the high resolution data, it was a minimum area of an acre of forest, and that in the that definition in the high resolution data is tied to the USDA Forest Service FIA data. With the NLCD data I mentioned, it's like that. If 20% of a 30 meter by 30 meter area on the ground was forested, it could be detected by the Landsat satellite data.
Great. We have a few other questions. I'll go to one that has some opportunity for discussion from Janet. Could you please expand on the implications of fragmentation and conversion of some forests to areas that are now tree canopy outside forests? And how do those changes affect ecosystems, biodiversity, and climate resilience?
Yes, so we did see that there was a trend towards forest fragmentation, especially in central Maryland, where we also saw the greatest loss to development. And this is largely, new development going in existing forest and tree canopy areas, including road building and other infrastructure. And then when it divides a forest area off completely from connectivity, then if it fell beneath an acre in size, that is where remaining tree canopy would be considered tree canopy outside forest. So, and generally, I would say there is a lot of evidence in the literature about forest fragmentation, and generally it's seen that as forests move from large blocks to smaller and smaller blocks, that the rate of loss in each smaller size becomes greater. And that may be a pattern that we see. Just want to highlight Montgomery County, which actually had a greater loss of tree canopy outside forest than from forest. And then the inverse is seen in Prince George's and Anne Arundel County, where there was greater loss of forest to development and still significant, but a smaller portion of the loss was in tree canopy outside forest.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think a lot of that question also speaks to some really larger scale questions about ecosystem function and interior forest versus edge habitat and the different species that are capable of utilizing those spaces. We could do an entire other hour on that, I'm sure. Yes. We also have quite a few questions on retention banks, including specifically looking at how that is going to change, or utilizing them is going to change as retention banks are no longer going to be able to sell credits after mid-2024. So what's going to happen to those acres? How long will they be retained? Why that decision has been made to discontinue that practice, et cetera.
Yeah, the why of the decision, I don't think we can comment on. That was decided by the state legislature, and we're simply responding to their questions about it. I'm actually not sure what the plan is for after 2024. I feel like there might be some participants who could answer that question potentially. If so, please feel free to put it in the chat. But yeah,
And-
that was the state's decision. We're just sort of doing what they asked us. But I mean, I would agree that certainly there's benefits to preserving forest as well.
Mhm. Yeah, we saw a lot of the benefits in the data of forest protection, but I think that it's more a question of what is allowed within the Forest Conservation Act, and if protection of forests proceeds through other mechanisms, that can continue to happen while mitigation banking shifts towards investing in planted forest. But yeah, just an observation there. I definitely recognize the role of retention banks, but I think as a policy question, there was a decision that tree planting was more strongly desired. So,
and sort of related to those planted areas, are there requirements for planting banks to be a particular size with specified diversity of species to foster development of forests rather than plantations? There's one interesting question on that.
Some counties do have minimum size requirements, and each county has its own requirements about the makeup of banks. The report does have a list that links to every county's individual requirements that you can refer to learn more about that. And the minimum size is usually either 1 or 10 acres.
Great, thank you. Betsy Mendelson had a question on the y-axis unit of one of the graphs that Susan shared. And as she specified, it was toward the end of your initial discussion.
I think was that the forest change associated with development. Yeah,
Yes.
that was acres. So for all of the lost data, we were looking at acres. And so in that case, Prince George's County's total combined forest and tree canopy loss was a little over 5,500 acres.
Great, thank you. We also had a question, Sean, if you're still on, if you would like to clarify which data set you're looking for.
Oh, yeah, just a comment about data in general. So the URL for the project overall is chesapeakeconservancy.org/MD Forest Study 2022. And that will link to a story map that includes the executive summary from the report, links to download the report, and also links to download data associated with the report. So the data are publicly available, and there's zip files you can download, and you can reach out to the Chesapeake Conservancy if you're not seeing some data that you're interested in, or if you have any questions about the data.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions. It is 11:06, so I do want to be mindful of everyone's time if you have any upcoming
and
conflicts.
I see that comment about the planting opportunity data set. Yes, that is included. And that was specifically, some of the data sets are derivatives of existing data or other publicly available data, but that is one that was specifically created for the purposes of this report and made publicly available.
Great. And when it comes to invasive species removal funding, my guess is that our response from our presenters will be that it is locally specific. I will let you weigh in. Is there any funding available for invasive species removal? I imagine that a lot of the invasive species are found in riparian buffers.
Mm-hmm. I would agree, and I think there might be I think there is some funding available that might filter from state and federal sources down to the local level. But we did not see a lot of information about like comprehensive efforts at the state level to address invasive species specifically. And that might be an interesting area either for further focus. I mean, we also found a bit of a lack of data that wasn't just anecdotal. So I think more might be needed there. Oh, local tree, I see the question on local tree programs. How was the data collected? That was by survey. Addie, if you want to comment.
Yeah, that was basically by surveying municipalities, counties, and key people at the state and federal level who would have that type of information. As I mentioned, it was not a complete review. A lot of the majority of municipalities didn't respond to our request for information. And if it was a private effort, then we were sort of relying on somebody knowledgeable from that county mentioning it to us. So definitely programs may have slipped through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I see the comment on stream restoration project. I think there has been some Chesapeake Bay Trust funding made available to do some research on stream restorations that involve removing a lot of tree and forest canopy cover. Just wanted to comment because I've seen that, but that was not addressed in our study. But yeah, the comments on invasive species, I think all of us, especially those of us that live in Central Maryland, see them everywhere.
Absolutely. And I will also note that we did have a webinar on that very topic a couple of months back with Rod Simmons and a representative from a company that performs stream restorations. So we had a good discussion on that, but there are a lot of other related topics to continue that discussion going forward. At this time, I don't believe that video has been posted to the Maryland Forestry Foundation's website. But it will be hosted as the foundation gets set up with a YouTube channel in the future, and as that site gets updated. So that will be available for viewing at a later date, as will this session. And I think we are up against the limitations of time, but I want to thank all of our speakers again for joining us today. This was a really fascinating discussion. I'm really excited to delve into the report. And I'm sure there will be a lot more discussion around this area in the future. So thank you all again, and thank you to everyone who attended today. We appreciate the attendance, all the great questions, and especially the excellent presentations.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And Gary, do you have any final comments, or would you like to just wrap things up?
No, I agree with your assessment. It was an excellent presentation. I want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank Kate and Susan and Audi for their work and the collaboration that it represents and the time that has been put. It certainly raised a lot of interest and a lot of questions, and I think that the study will continue to be used and then examined in the days ahead, and I'm pleased to see the resources made available to do so. So thank you very much for your time, and we will follow up with you and post this as soon as we can.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, friends.